The most scandalous marriage of the Renaissance. The year is 1493, and one of the most beautiful women in all of Italy is about to marry one of the most eligible bachelors, the 22-year-old son of the Pope. This is a match made in heaven, right? Well, not exactly, because while this woman had been promised to this man since she was 14, she is now 27, and she has spent the last 13 years resisting her arranged marriage to him tooth and nail. But alas, her father, the infamous Pope Alexander VI, has other plans for her. This is the story of Lucretia Borgia and her rise to become the most hated woman in all of Renaissance Italy. You know those types of fathers who force their daughters to marry an abusive man and then disown her when she runs away from her toxic husband. Yeah, me neither. Pope Alexander VI was born into the Borgia clan, a family so notorious for their wealth, power, and corruption that Michelangelo would later immortalize them as the quintessential symbol of the poisonous church-state alliance in his David. His predecessor had been a Borgia too, and when he died, Alexander's father, fearing for his own safety, bribed the cardinals into voting for Alexander instead of his older brother. So when Alexander came to power, he did everything he could to repay his father's kindness, including marrying off his children to the most powerful families in Italy to secure alliances and maintain his power. Lucretia was his only daughter, and she had been promised to the 12-year-old son of the Duke of Ferrara when she was just 14. At the time, it was common for girls to be betrothed at a young age and then married several years later, when they reached the appropriate age of consent. But Lucretia was never going to agree to marry a child. She wanted to dedicate her life to God and saw any sexual relations as a sin. And then the double whammy happened. The boy she was promised to, the future Ercole, grew up to be grotesquely ugly and grotesquely gay. Now, you might think that these two things are related, but trust me, they're not. It's just that both were true. When Lucretia turned 18, she began resisting her father's wishes to marry the now grown-up Ercole. For 4 years, she resisted and won, refusing to accept the marriage proposal. Finally, her father relented and agreed to let her marry a different duke, but this new suitor was older than her father and had 2 wives and 5 children already. Lucretia said no again. Then when she turned 22, her father threw her in a castle with a now 22-year-old Ercole and locked the doors until she agreed to sleep with him. When that failed, he brought in a priest who threatened to deny her communion unless she slept with her fiancé. As a last resort, he even threatened to take away her dowry, which in addition to being cruel and unusual, was also a terrible business decision. Meanwhile, Lucretia had found an unlikely ally in her cousin, the aforementioned Michelangelo, who had recently completed David and was hoping to land a lucrative position painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. When he heard of his cousin's plight, he begged her father, the Pope, to allow her to live out her days as a nun instead, but the Pope refused, stating that she had already been promised to the Duke of Ferrara, and once a property is pledged, it cannot be returned. On their wedding night, Lucretia's new husband tore off her clothes and raped her. She scratched and bit him and he slapped her across the face, knocking out a tooth. When she finally got free and ran out of the bedroom, he chased after her, tackled her and beat her until she miscarried. As word spread of what the 22-year-old bride had endured, the citizens of Ferrara took up arms and stormed the castle, killing the Duke and all of his men. But by this point, Lucretia's father, Pope Alexander VI, had already arranged for her to marry yet another man. This time it was to a French nobleman more than twice her age, who would eventually become the King of France. I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but let's just say that this was not the happily ever after that Lucretia had hoped for. Want to know why? Watch part 2 here.